Again, and welcome to the AARP Stop Asian Hate panel on advocating for our elders. My name is Daphne Kwok. I'm Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, working on behalf of the AAPI audience. And it's so great to be here. On behalf of AARP, I want to welcome you to this critical discussion about anti-Asian hate, particularly as it impacts our elders. As many of you already know, AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that has been working tirelessly to promote the health and well-being of older Americans for more than 60 plus years. Over the past year, we have seen an increase in hate incidences, particularly elderly hate and violence. As a wise friend and fierce defender of our elders and the families and friends who are giving care to our elders, AARP is proud to host the Stop Asian Hate panel. And we are thankful to all of our AAPI community members, AAPI allies, our colleagues and beyond for joining us today to have a critical discussion about this public health crisis. AARP has been supporting the AAPI community for many, many years. And we've been on the ground with our partners from San Francisco to New York to Oregon, which I was just with right before this, at cultural celebrations, important ceremonies, and so many community events. We have volunteers in every state, members who are there to help fight the good fight in DC as well, on issues that impact our elders. And we are so fortunate for our ethnic media partners, many of them who are here today, and we really want to send a special shout out and thank you to our ethnic partners, media partners who continue every day to inform and educate our community. Today, we're going to discuss the recent attacks on our elders and the anti-Asian sentiment and hate incidences that we have all witnessed either in person or through the media. And every morning, I just cringe when I wake up to wonder what are the latest attacks that have happened in our community nationwide. We have with us a panel of experts who will address the topic of anti-Asian hate directed at the elderly from their lens as advocates and communicators. And our panelists will then take your questions via the Zoom chat, and we hope that you will ask the questions. Before we begin, I want to let our participants know that you can type your questions in the chat box, and then we'll have Q&A after the first half of this event. But unfortunately, for those of you that are joining on the phone, we aren't able to have you send in or call in chat questions. But if you are able to get onto the Zoom invitation link, please do so that you can ask questions through the chat. Additionally, just want to let you know this event is being recorded. We have a lot of people that have told us they are not able to join right now, but would love to be able to hear the presentation. And you can access the recording on our social media through our Facebook community page on AARP, AAPI later after the event. Now we have with us today a powerhouse of organizations that have deep roots in advocacy and communications and who have a wealth of information for our AAPI community. I'm so pleased to have John Yang, the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Really pleased to have Joon, the President and CEO of the National Asia Pacific Center on Aging in Seattle, Washington. And Leezel Tanglao, a bridge journalist from one of our national partners, the Asian American Journalists Association. So we're so pleased. Welcome to all of you. Welcome. And before we begin, I'd like to bring on a very, very special guest who's joined us today for opening remarks, Edna Kane-Williams. She's our Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AARP. We've been colleagues for the past 8 years, and I can tell you there isn't a greater champion for our AAPI work than Edna Kane-Williams. Thank you so much for joining us, Edna.
Thank you, Daphne. It's important for me to be here this afternoon and to serve as a vehicle for AARP's concern and really outreach about what's going on and lend our collective voice to make sure that people know this is not, this can't stand, that we have to find solutions that solve for what's happening in this country today. It's just absolutely horrific. we cannot overstate it, and AARP absolutely stands with the AAPI community. I want to take a minute and read a statement that our CEO, Joanne Jenkins, released back in March. Our nation must stand united against coronavirus, which has disproportionately sickened and killed older Americans. These troubling new hate crimes data mean that older Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders not only are concerned about coronavirus, they now also face increased violence and harassment fueled by prejudice, hatred, and xenophobia. This is a combination that could create barriers to seeking testing, treatment, information, or vaccination. At a moment when we as a country must come together and do everything in our power to help contain the COVID spread, AARP strongly condemns all racially motivated violence and harassment. In addition to this statement, we're ensuring that not only our national office, but our state offices, as Daphne mentioned, we're 38 million members strong. That includes staff and volunteers all across the country. We are collectively united to doing everything that we can to stand as an organization against Asian hate. We have launched a number of initiatives. We were one of 80 brands that signed on to a collective statement that was printed in major newspapers by the National Advertisers Alliance condemning Asian hate. The recent issue of our magazine, which I hope that everyone can get a copy of, includes a focus on our AARP community, celebrating, lifting them up, and again, standing with them so that the country knows unequivocally where AARP stands. We have a host of, in honor of this month especially, where we celebrate Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. We've, under Daphne's leadership and direction, have launched any number of activities, state, local, and national levels, again, to make sure that AARP is a megaphone for this message. This is not a time, and I'll repeat that this is not a time for organizations to stand silently along the sidelines, hoping that people get the message. We really have to be active allies, not passive allies. This is not a benign event that's happening. It's malicious, it's malignant, and it really must stop. And we have to signal our support of the AAPI community and our absolute rejection of what we see happening in no uncertain terms. This webinar is just one small part of that effort, but I'm so happy that we're convening this esteemed panel so that we can hear from them, talk with them, ask questions, but most importantly, I hope that everyone leaves with a sense of what they can do individually, because yes, organizations like AARP has to step up, but each one of us individually has to step up as well. And I know that the audience here this afternoon has that commitment and that energy. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it back to Daphne.
Thank you so much, Edna. And as she said, this certainly is not a time for anybody to be on the sidelines. AARP, we are using our megaphone. Okay, so let me first introduce the panelists. The first one is my good longtime friend, John Yang, who's President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. He's a superpower attorney who, with 2 decades of policy, litigation, and corporate expertise, who has so wonderfully come back into the community to lead AAJC, to fight for civil rights, empower AAPIs through public policy advocacy, education, litigation. He's a co-founder of the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center here in DC, and that organization really has been serving and providing direct legal services to AAPIs. And you might wonder whether he got dressed up for us today, or was it because he met with the Vice President of the United States to talk about voting rights right before this. So welcome to John. And I also hope that you had a chance to hear John in March as he testified before the House Committee to address discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. I really encourage everyone to listen to his testimony, which was extremely strong. Then from the West Coast, we really want to welcome Joon, the the CEO of the National Asia Pacific Center on Aging. We've had a wonderful opportunity to partner with Joon and all of his organizational affiliates. It is the nation's only nonprofit organization with the mission to preserve and promote the dignity, well-being, and quality of life of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and diverse communities throughout this country. And Joon and his team, really, since COVID has hit, has worked tirelessly to fill the language gap during the pandemic for homebound AAPI older adults and their caregivers. So we're looking forward to hearing more about the work that he and all of the agencies are doing on the ground. He's a former executive director of the Korean American Coalition, KAC, in Los Angeles, where under his leadership, they received numerous awards. We also have Leezel Tanglao, a bridge journalist with one of our national partners, once again, the Asian American Journalist Association. And as a bridge journalist, she's at the intersection of editorial, product, business development, and sales. She's worked at several media companies, including HuffPost, Associated Press, CNN, CBSNews.com, Vice News, Now This, ABCNews.com, KCBS, KCAL, and Press Enterprise. Leezel is currently also the Director of Audience Insights and Innovation for the Point Sky. And she's a Vice President of the Filipino Young Leaders Program, PhilPro, and we know a lot of your members there, and is a chair of the PhilPro COVID-19 Task Force. She's also the Project Director and spokesperson for the Caretaker Project's Tayo Help Desk for the Filipino community for COVID-19. So welcome to all of our panelists, and let's begin. So our first question that I want to ask you is about the tremendous amount of attention that's been given to anti-Asian hate incidences, anti-Asian hate directed specifically at the elderly in the media and social media. However, racial injustice like this, as we all know, it didn't just happen within the last week, 30 days, year. It's been going on for the last century plus. And it's not unique to our AAPI community. Nor is the advocacy work and communication works that all of your groups are doing. So, but how, can you tell us about how has this round been unique? And I'm gonna start it off with asking John.
Great, thank you very much, Daphne. And thank you to AARP for hosting this. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to all of you. And I think it's useful to talk about both how this moment is not unique as well as how it's unique. It's not unique in the sense that, as Daphne said, we've been facing racism, certainly for the country, we've been facing racism since the founding of our country. This particular strand of racism as it relates to Asian Americans, you could say is approximately 100, 150 years old. And why I say that is I trace it back in part to the Chinese railroad workers. You know, when the Chinese railroad workers were doing the most dangerous work, dynamiting through the mountains to get to Promontory Point or the Golden Spike in Utah, they were being lynched back in California, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco. There were laws being passed against them. The Page Act that prohibited Chinese women from immigrating to this country. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that prohibited Chinese from being citizens of this country. Then you fast forward to 60 years later when you have the incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent. You notice I say Americans of Japanese descent, solely because of the so-called fear or suspicion of dual loyalties against the Empire of Japan. While at the same time, there are many family members of those people being incarcerated that was doing some of the most dangerous fighting in Italy, in Europe. It's part of what Asian Americans know as the famous 442nd Combat Regiment, the most decorated combat regiment in all of World War II. Then you think about 9/11, where there was a terrorist attack on our soil, but who received the backlash? It was the backlash against the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American community because of, again, this threat of terrorism. Now, the common thread, and this is a thread that is applicable today as well, is this notion of Asian Americans being seen as the foreigner, you know, what we call the perpetual foreigner syndrome. This notion that no matter how long we've been in the United States, whether we were born in the United States or not, that we are seen as a foreigner, that we're seen as an other, that we're seen as a threat. So anytime you have a threat in the United States, here, there's both the COVID-19 threat that we've talked about, the health threats, the economic threats, as well as this geopolitical tension, a real geopolitical tension against the Chinese government. The backlash happens against our Asian American community. So in that sense, it's not unique. But how it is unique is the amount of attention that this has gotten, where it has impacted our community. As Daphne said, the statistics show, and there's some great work being done by an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, that the elderly and women are disproportionately being attacked within our communities. And part of that is a recognition that those two populations are perceived as being more vulnerable. So as we're talking about solutions, that's one unique aspect that we have to recognize in how we craft solutions. The other unique aspect, which I actually think is a positive aspect in some ways, is the fact that you see the Asian American community galvanized in a different way, energized in a different way. You see actors, business people that are standing up, speaking out. And we haven't had that. Certainly, we haven't had that for over a generation. You know, the last time that something like this happened would have been Vincent Chin in 1982, who was murdered because two out-of-work auto workers thought that he was Japanese American. And during this height of the trade war regarding automobiles, he was targeted. I think the other last unique thing I would say is, and Daphne alluded to this, is this notion of allyship, right? And I think it's important because it's not lost on me that at the same time during this past year where we've seen escalated attacks against the Asian American community, we have seen so many incidents of racial discrimination against the African American community, you know, in the form of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, or more recently, Daunte Wright, that in the same period of time, we had an insurrection at the Capitol, literally only a few blocks from where I'm speaking right now. And so it's this common thread of racism, which is both in some ways unique to our time to the extent of the threat that's being presented, but it also, I think, presents an opportunity for all of us to come together to address this issue.
Thank you, John, for putting that so succinctly into one nutshell, really the history and where we are today. Joon, what about you?
Thanks so much, Daphne. And it's really hard to go after John, but John, I have to say I'm a huge fan of your tie collection. So recently, I had the opportunity to contribute to a panel at the ASA conference, and one of my colleagues said something that really resonated with me. He said that at the start of the pandemic,
ASA stands for what? American Society on Aging.
That's right. That's correct. Thanks so much, Daphne. So one of my colleagues said something that really resonated with me. He said that at the beginning of the pandemic, all commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion were thrown out the window. And I think in order to speak to the uniqueness of the rise of anti-Asian hate targeting our older adults, we need to define context. And by context, I'm referring to the fact that for the first time since the beginning of the 21st century, whether by tone, tenor, or policies, we saw our country's leaders publicly give hate license to express itself. From the period of October of last year to March of this year, we conducted a study and surveyed over 5,000 Asian American Pacific Islanders throughout the country, the majority of them being our older adults. We found that 3 out of every 5 people have experienced racial discrimination, and the majority of them feel as though the country has become unsafe for them. Now, during the past 4 years, we saw damaging policies like public charge and repeal of language provisions in the Affordable Care Act. Now, I think what we're witnessing now are the compounding effects of a broken system that have historically neglected our elders and are continuing to neglect them today. Now, let me give you an example. So 56 to 60% of Asian American older adults speak English less than very well. And what that means is that they have language barriers. And language barriers have been proven to lead to isolation and prevent people from receiving much needed medical and social services, and has a direct impact on their quality of life. But what is more is that we also need to acknowledge what language is. And language is more than just a tool. It's an extension and an expression of our identity and ourselves. But also, ultimately, language is power. And when you consider the historical implications of linguistic imperialism, we know that language has been used to both acquire and deny power in our country as well as globally. So when you combine the effects of the threat of COVID-19 and compound that with hate and discrimination, and we also add in the fact that there there really aren't enough language resources for our older adults, particularly in the middle of a national and global crisis. I think what our elders are in right now is quite possibly a perfect storm, which is why it's important for all of society to care about these issues and come together, as John mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Joon. Thank you so much. And the power in the words is so true. Leezel.
Yes. So thank you to John and Joon, who really set a great foundation, just why we're such in a unique moment. I mean, like they said previously, a lot of these things is not new. I think what is unique in this moment right now, especially from the coverage of all these incidences, is that the fact that it's like no question why we should be covering this. I think as a journalist, being in this business almost 20 years, I can't tell you how many times I've had to fight for a lot of these stories around Asian Americans just to even get it considered as newsworthy to my editors in the multiple newsrooms that I've had to be at. And what we're seeing right now is, which is promising, some progress within that, not only because we've got more diverse reporters, but as well as people in management and decision-making places. And not only just Asian American journalists in general, but all our allies, because I think there's finally an awakening and recognition that, yes, our community matters. You know, we may not be as large as certain other communities in the US, but that does not preclude the fact that, you know, we are people too, we are contributors to this country. And even our most vulnerable folks have a story to tell. So I think what is unique that I've seen, at least in the last year or so, is the more willingness to be open about very uncomfortable situations and stories, and the openness to cover them in a way that is accurate to these communities.
I want to just say that what John mentioned is that what makes things different, and as I've seen it, I've been working in the community for a long time, is really the different parts of the community that have been activated, and representation matters. And in journalism, especially now, the number of AAPI journalists across the board really has made a difference. And as you said, Leezel, the allyship, those that are really supporting our journalists who are really on the front line, and also have really been taking a lot of verbal assaults and other kinds of threats against them for even reporting on this right now. So our hats off to all the journalists, Asian American journalists. My second question is now about the response and the steps that companies and organizations have taken to address the impact that these hate crime incidents directed at AAPIs have had on our older AAPI community. As John has mentioned, there's data that shows there's been a negative impact on our community. Also, as Joon has talked about too, the mental health impact, and now really the fear of going outside, even to perform basic activities like going to the grocery or shopping, or even to get the vaccinations. So I'd like to know what your organization has been doing to protect AAPIs and AAPI elders during this time. And I'm going to start with Leezel.
Yeah, as we all know, representation is so important. And I think if anything, the last couple of months in the last year has taught us, I think it's been, again, a recognition of like how invisible we are to a lot of, you know, groups and industries. So I think here at AAJA, we've really made a proactive effort to make sure that not only our fellow AAJA members had the resources and guidelines to help them in their reporting of these incidences, but just, you know, just guidance for the general journalism community as well as communications. So, you know, we've been really proactive, especially around the times of the Atlanta shootings, as well as the FedEx shootings, to make sure that, you know, journalists were aware of like the type of language they use in news coverage, to avoid, you know, further fueling, you know, certain stereotypes that just don't do anything to tell the accurate story, and just making sure we're, you know, everyone's providing the context to really truly tell these narratives and not fall back on the usual things that we've seen over the past. So a good example of this is, you know, with the Atlanta shooting as well as the FedEx shooting that happened within relatively around the same time, we put out a pronunciation guide for the folks, the victims' names. And, you know, as somebody that has grown up as an Asian American, I can't tell you how many times I would say myself, as well as my fellow peers, have gotten their names mispronounced. And, you know, names are important. And especially in situations like that, you know, like, you know, how it's, you know, how you're identified, how you are portrayed matters a lot. Not only for on the personal level, but just as a community. So I think for us, it was really important that, you know, we put these resources out there and make it available to everyone that is covering this story, as well as the community abroad, because again, these are people, these are people's lives, and it's important that we tell it correctly and accurately.
And that's why it's so important that we have organizations like the Asian American Journalists Association that can provide that guidance and resource as well. So thank you. Joon, NAPCA provides so many services to our AAPI elders. Can you expand on what your organization has been providing in light of the pandemic and these publicized attacks on our elders?
Absolutely. Thanks, Daphne. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, our organization, our headquarters is based out of Seattle. And as we all know, back in December of 2019, the first confirmed case of COVID-19 was here in Seattle as well. And so as soon as that happened, our older adults, our Asian American older adults in our Senior Community Service Employment Program, also called CSEP, started reaching out and letting us know that they've been experiencing some levels of discrimination. And also that they also began sharing with us that they were afraid that the country was racializing the COVID-19 coronavirus as well. And so we reached out to our federal partners, and we quickly realized that the administration wasn't planning for anything. And so we moved all of our 1,200 plus CSEP participants onto our company's sick leave policies so that we can keep them home safe, as well as provide income support through wages. Now, I want to explain a little context behind the CSEP program because I think it'll be important for folks to know. The CSEP program was developed alongside programs like Medicare and Medicaid by the Johnson administration, a part of his President Johnson's Great Society initiative to eradicate poverty and racial injustice. And the core of the program is meant to serve older adults experiencing poverty with barriers toward economic security and employment, with job training and wages. So we did that in the early months of 2020, but then we also realized that the administration would not be providing meaningful language access to resources and information regarding the COVID. And so at our organization, we designed and launched our in-language multilingual helpline to serve elders throughout the 50 states. And so we developed a program in which when older adults throughout the country with language barriers could call in and receive support to receive emergency resources in their geographic locations. And thanks to Daphne and AARP during the fall of last year, with their support, we were able to support our older adults with census registrations as well as voter reg support as well. And so not too long ago, just a few months ago, our organization developed this interactive virtual map providing locations to all of the vaccine sites throughout the country. And we've been supporting with booking vaccinations for our older adults. And most recently, we partnered with rideshare company Lyft to provide free and safe transportation to and from vaccine sites. Since launch of the program of last year, we received over 4,000 calls. And it demonstrates the need for in-language resources and access to these resources with meaningful support with language throughout the country. And I just also want to add that we're currently in the process of working with the Department of Justice as well as the National Center on Elder Abuse to develop in-language programs and resources for our elders as well.
Fantastic. That in language, every time I talk to you, Joon, you mentioned the need for in language. So thank you so much. John, I'm sure AAJC has had to bring more attention to the advocacy work for AAPI elders. And can you share with us perhaps some of the work that you're doing on behalf of the elders?
Absolutely. And I think just jumping off of what Joon is saying, part of it is making sure that the government recognizes that in-language resources are critical during periods like this, and making sure that whether it's their websites, to have those translated into materials. We've seen much better translations on DOJ in literally just recent weeks in the wake of the Atlanta shootings and the like. The other component to advocacy is making sure that we get the resources to where we need them, to organizations like Joon's, to organizations like AAJA, because the reality is, our community is still a pretty limited community. So the ability to have the resources that we need, the capacity that we need, it's still growing. And so whether it's the federal government and making sure that there are grants available through the federal government programs, or whether it's advocating with corporations to make sure they are investing in our corporations, in our communities, that's critically important at this time. Certainly another piece of advocacy that we're doing, there's two pieces that I would mention. One would be, again, at the government level, making sure that they use the right words. And I say this deliberately because on one level, people would say, well, those are just words. But we saw the damage that the words of the White House, previous White House, had in 2020 when they used terms like Chinese flu, Wuhan virus, or worse derivations of that. And we want to make clear and make sure that this administration addressed that head on and made it very, very clear that there was a new understanding. There was a revived understanding of how damaging those words would be. Then the last thing I would say is just on the ground, there are so many great efforts happening. And so part of our job, frankly, is just to lift up those efforts. Efforts like the community ambassador programs in New York and Oakland, where you have people that are walking the elderly to grocery stores or getting groceries for them. We have programs like Asian American Federation in New York that are publishing guides in multiple languages about how to keep people safe, right? Palm cards that are being done by our affiliate in Los Angeles that do the same thing. And then just making sure everyone knows about all of these different materials. And then the last thing is, one of the things that we at AAJC are doing is what's called bystander intervention training. This just gives people the tools to act if they see an act of hate. We don't want people to get themselves in physical harm's way, but there are so many things that can be done to make that victim feel a little bit more safe when they encounter an incident of hate. Over the course of this last year, we've trained over 75,000 people, and the interest is just remains high, which certainly heartens me and makes me believe that we can make some positive progress, even under these tragic circumstances.
Well, John, your training with Hollaback, that partnership, we are working closely with you, actually, in producing in-language videos on the 5Ds. And so by the end of May, we're looking to roll it out. So we thank you for that partnership, but also the opportunity to continue to serve. So another question I have for you, what are the gaps that individuals and organizations could fill from the advocacy perspective at this time for our elders? And John, I'll go to you first on that one.
Well, so one piece that I've been pushing right now, especially since it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, is education. Because let's face it, like for an organization like mine that focuses on federal advocacy or laws, you can't legislate away racism. You just can't. We have to be real about that. So how do you get to a better space? For Asian American community, as with many other communities, part of it is just education, making sure that Asian Americans are seen as part of American society. The reality is, especially at the K through 12 space, there's so little taught about Asian American history, right? Literally, if you look at the photo of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Golden Spike, and Daphne, I know you know this because you've been out there, the photo is of all white men, and it literally erases the contributions of Asian American. Even World War II, sort of the picture is normally of white men. Now, increasingly, we've talked about the Navajo code talkers. We've talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, but we need more of that. And so my one very concrete ask of all of you right now is, if you are a parent and you have kids in grade school, just talk to your teacher about having one day, even 1 hour, teaching a little bit of Asian American history. There's a number of organizations, mine included, but we don't have a monopoly on this, that has like K through 12 curriculum that you can just pull off the shelf that teachers can use. If all of us can do that, just have one class one day, we really do start to move needles about the understanding of the role of Asian Americans in this country.
Absolutely, the curriculum, education, we've got to get the Asian American history, which is American history, into the American curriculum for all levels. Before I go on to the next question, I just wanted to put a reminder in, if anyone has questions for the speakers, if you could put it in the Q&A button below, that would be great. And we'll get to the questions shortly. Leezel, what do you see as solutions from a communication standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, with the era that we're in now, I think there's a much more openness to talk about a lot of these very difficult topics. So I think for to help, you know, other journalists really help surface a lot of these topics, it's really being, you know, helping us, you know, pointing us to the right direction that, hey, this is what's happening if we're not already on there. I think for a lot of folks that have made this their beats, which is, I think, is also promising, seeing a lot more of my fellow peers actually covering this full time, you know, just being able to communicate to us like what's happening. I mean, we can't be everywhere, but, you know, that having that continuous community engagement, both from the media side as well as the community, is really crucial to making sure that this story doesn't die. It doesn't just last one news cycle, because this is going to continue to happen until we, you know, fully make sure that we're holding those folks accountable. And a lot of that goes back to making sure that we are, you know, being factual, we're being accurate, and telling what is actually happening right now. So.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure all of us, Joon and John, have taken so many calls from journalists and Asian American journalists, and we have too, and it's been great for me to be able to point them back down into the community, to the community organizations on the ground, to be able to give those journalists the real news of what's happening on the ground. Joon, what solutions do you see from a community-based organization perspective?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, what AARP is doing through this panel is an incredibly important step. And when we look at it from the perspective of community-based organizations, you know, I would recommend, or we would recommend, that in strategic planning for organizations, that you include the needs of AAPI communities. In addition to that, I would encourage programs and program service providers to provide cultural competency to staff. In addition to that, I think it's important to make sure that the services are linguistically and culturally appropriate, that meet the needs of our older adults as well. One of the things that we try to incorporate within our organization is a feedback process where we get to learn from the people we serve and try to see what we can do to improve. And so, you know, the feedback process is really important. And above all of that, I think collecting the data, disaggregated data regarding how our older adults from the 40 plus subpopulations within this huge AAPI community is crucial to ensure that resources are coming back into our AAPI communities.
As you said, the data, right, is key to everything. And I have to say, over all the years, I'm so pleased that the Asian American community, that at least we have one refrain that's going out. Everyone in every meeting is talking about the importance of data, and disaggregated data. And with census data just starting to roll out now, and analysis of the data there, it's going to be really very key as we all continue to build out our work as well. Let's go to a question we have. We actually have a question from Mark from China Press, who wants to know about personal stories. How has this issue, the anti-Asian hate, impacted you personally or professionally? So who would like to start first? Who'd like to share? How has this impacted you personally and professionally?
I can go. So I think it's hard to separate the two, right? Because especially something that's so deeply, something that impacts a lot of us in so many ways. Definitely living in an intergenerational household as well. Every time I see, you know, being part of the media, being on that end, telling these stories, and then also seeing it being covered, and it's hard not to be impacted and seeing like these incidences that you see almost weekly now of our elderly getting impacted by this. I think about my older relatives and my other friends who have, you know, kind of talked about, what do we do? Like, you know, this moment of crisis, what do we do? And so at least for me personally, it's really made me much more aware and acutely aware in terms of like making sure that we are checking in with each other, not only in my own local community, but all within my network. And that's both on just on the personal side, but as well as the professional side, because it's tough covering these type of stories in a prolonged time period. And I will say with AAJA, we've made sure, making sure like, you know, mental health is a big priority too, making sure we have, we've, you know, connected our members to resources and just making sure that we're checking in because this has been a very tough time for all of us. We are trying to, you know, find ways to process and grieve, and that's across all generations. So I think for me, you know, it's kind of that both that intersection of being proactive in where I can help in the professional sense, but as well as in the personal sense, and making sure, you know, everyone is doing okay as best as they can.
Yeah.
I was really pleased to see AAJA had that program to support the journalists around the mental health, the stress during this past year must be tremendous. So kudos to AAJA.
One thing I might add is certainly personally, one of the things this has caused me to do, which I think is true for many Asian Americans, is also talk to our parents about what's going on. And there's two components to that. One is the safety component that we've talked about. But the second is a more difficult conversation, you know, about racism in America, because sometimes our parents have, at least I'll speak for myself, and my mother will admit this, have not shown up in the best way for the Black community, for the African American community. And this is an opportunity to talk about racism in America as a whole and how this is intersectional. They're seeing this racism against the Asian Americans. We need to connect that. More specific to that, I want to make sure we get this point across because I think it's very important, is that yes, we do see some viral videos of other communities of color that are attacking Asian Americans. But let's be very clear about this. The studies that we have seen, and I'll admit there's not much data, but the studies that we have seen that the attackers overwhelmingly are not other communities of color. They are Caucasian males. And I think this is important because there are many videos out there. I admit there's videos that go viral that show an African American being very direct that is attacking an Asian American. But that is not what we are seeing in terms of the vast majority. My understanding is there's another study that will be coming out sometime next week that confirms the same thing, that only about 5% of the attackers, somewhere in that range, are African Americans.
Thank you for that. And we really need to remember that. And so we should all look out for that latest study that comes out as well too. Maybe John, when you see that, if we don't see it, maybe you can help circulate it to us and we can help send that around as well. Joon, did you want to answer that question about personally and professionally?
Yeah, I mean, being here in Seattle, I have experienced some racism directed towards me during the height of the pandemic because, the country and its leaders spent so much time racializing the virus that it almost seems natural for people to just equate, blaming our communities because it happened in such a big scale. I want to share a story, I guess, of one of our program participants that she shared with me not too long ago. This happened very recently to her. She's around my own mother's age. She's in her late 60s and early 70s. And she was getting into an elevator the other day and a man walks in with her. And when he sees her, he puts his hand on the door, blocking the door from closing, and tells her to get out of the elevator because she looks Chinese. And how she responded to that was she just put her head down and walked out. And these are the stories that we hear over and over again. And for many of us in our communities who have very close ties to our grandparents or our parents for that matter, and we know that we grow up in households where it's an important value to respect and honor our elders. These are the stories that we're hearing over and over again in our organization, and it's painful to say the least.
Thank you. We have one question here, and I'm going to direct it to John because it's a follow-up to the comments that you just made about how can we address race relations between racial groups and do this in a manner that's respectful and constructive?
I very much appreciate that question. I think it's multifaceted. On one level, I always think about it as a retail conversation. So part of it is making sure you have the small group conversations and safe spaces so that we can be courageous and say, yeah, we admit sort of here are some of the prejudices that our community have, and then have that dialogue that way. That's the way to be honest about it. You know, at a quote unquote national level, you know, it's interesting because, and someone posted this, Sherilyn Eiffel from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and I had recently a Washington Post Live conversation that we were really able to talk about that in a different way. I think these conversations have to happen at all of these levels. One thing that's going to stick with me, frankly, forever from this period of time, and this goes to this intersectionality, is after the Atlanta killings, people like Sherilyn, Mark Morial from the National Urban League, Alfonso David from the Human Rights Campaign, all reached out to me right away to say, hey, this is tragic. What can we do to help? You know, we're here for you. And so I decided to do one of these Zoom calls just to connect with all of them at the same time. And when I did that, I saw friends, I saw colleagues, but when I looked at their faces, I saw the Charleston Church, I saw the Pulse nightclub, I saw El Paso and Tree of Life Synagogue. And so that was just actually a very powerful moment to me to show what we all had in common. And now the other aspect of this, and I didn't say it at the time to them, is I think all of these circumstances, who was the aggressor? The aggressor, again, was a white male that had elements, frankly, typically with white supremacist ties. So when we're talking about some of these difficult issues around race, we got to be very careful not to let sort of some of what is seen on the media divide us. And when I say that, it's no offense to AAJA, right? I mean, I think they do a very responsible job, but there are people that are trying to foment viral videos and then kind of lift that up and think about, well, who is it that's really vulnerable here? And then I think we will all come to the same conclusion. It is communities of color, it is women, and it's the elderly.
Thank you. We have one question here from Amit, and he's with Hindi Radio, Mira Sanji. He's talking about education and curriculum and children. And he says, not only do we need to educate our children about Asian American history, but we also need to educate our children on racism, its history, its effect, and its origin. What initiatives can we support to educate children to be informed and respectful of other cultures? Anyone want to take that one? How do we take it down to that lower, the younger generation? And we've got to start from that younger generation. We really need to rebuild society, right?
I feel like John may have answered that question in referring to the need for curriculum in our K-12 system to make sure that even if it's 1 hour, to ensure that there's correct information about AAPI communities. And I think John and Daphne, you both talked about briefly about the railroad system and how the pictures in our history books are of white people, and that's not accurate. And so I think echoing what John spoke about earlier is really important.
One of the things I'll just mention too, it goes back to going into the school system, is that one of our colleagues, Dr. Erwin Tan, asked several of us if we might go to one of the schools here in the Virginia area during the month of May to do readings to children grade, I think it was 3 through 5. And so my colleague Ron Mori and I are doing it. He is going to read about the Japanese Americans internment, but through a children's book about baseball. Now I'm going to read from an Angel Island immigration station story as it pertains to Chinese coming through Angel Island and that whole immigration story as well too. So I think it's through books as well. And now there are more and more books that are written for children about the Asian American experience. And I think that's another great way. Okay, we have a question here. Do you have bystander trainings in Chinese or Asian languages, John?
We do. We are starting to develop that. And each of our affiliates, so we have 4 affiliates in San Francisco, Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And so all of us are offering different versions. If you go to ihollaback.org, you will find the list of trainings. And then you could also go to advancingjustice.org. And that will also have a list of our trainings, and you could find, in language, it's just being developed. So I think we only have it in Chinese so far, and specifically Mandarin, but it is definitely something that we are trying to build out.
Absolutely. Okay, we have a question here from Candice Mack from Skylink TV, and this is for Leezel. The question is there more that can be done as a TV and media to help besides sharing, educating, and reporting on these hate crime incidences? Is there something else that the Asian press can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe thinking about creative partnerships, right? I mean, I think also really going back to leaning on our allies to get some of these stories out. I think sometimes it can be, we can fall into like these silos, right? Mainstream press, ethnic press, but in many ways we're covering the same story. And I think the more we can join forces together, the better that we can amplify these stories, not just on our own, but like together. And I think it also goes back to just, what else can we do in terms of system-wide to help in amplifying and making sure these stories get out there. I think it goes also back to just diversifying our staffs in all the places that we're at, and not just from the ground level, but also making sure we are helping folks move up, get promoted, and in key decision-making places, so that it's not such a struggle to defend why a story is newsworthy and whatnot.
Thank you. There's one question, I'm going to take it for myself since it's coming to AARP. It says, does AARP have funding to provide security devices to help the Asian elderly protect themselves from attacks or dangers? And I will say that we have been asking what is being provided. We know that whistles are being provided. We know that other mechanisms are being provided to the elderly. One of the things that we're about to come out also is to really do more education, in language education, like PSA videos on security tips. So this is one of the ways that we are going to continue to help inform and educate and protect our Asian elderly. But it's whether we actually have funding for security devices, I think that's something that we're still looking into as well too. We're about to wrap up, but I do want to say that we did get one comment here from someone in the community who has said, and I'll agree with her, that this has been an incredible panel, that all of you are providing tremendous information, and she would like to be able to invite some of you to speak at a panel or conference that she's putting together. I'm sure I'm going to answer yes for you guys, right? Because you're going to probably say yes. And for that individual,
But that would be consistent, Daphne, with your history with me, which is you volunteer me for your things and I just show up.
yeah, John, you're going to do that. Joon, you, Leezel, now you as well, as we continue to help our community. I can't find that chat right now, but I did see it. So we'll get back to that individual. Be happy to provide their contact information. And I'm sure that they would be, they and their staff, right? Because they do have staff, would be happy to get out and to share as well too. So as we wrap up, I just really want to ask you all if you had some closing thoughts that you wanted to say, or any recommendations how we can better support or become advocates for our AAPI elderly. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share that we haven't talked about to get on people's mind? Or are there any events that may be coming up that we ought to know about as well? So who wants to go first? We'll go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Who wants to say?
Well, this is John. Well, I guess one thing that you're hearing from all of us is that no gesture is too small. The main thing is just to do something. And we've tried to give you a number of different ideas about sort of how you could be involved. And the idea here is like, if all of us do a little bit, right? Like the three of us are fortunate. Our full-time job is to help represent our community, but it doesn't have to be. We really need all of you, whether you're in a corporate setting or in a government setting, to think about language access, to think about how you drive some more resources to our really local community groups that could use those resources. If you could just embed that in your own work in any small way, then you've contributed to what all of us are doing.
I think what I would add is what was mentioned before, data, data, data. I'm all about data. And half of that equation is making sure we get the right data. And that includes all of us, making sure if there's a survey that comes out, if there's like a call for that, making sure we get our community to take it. Because that's where we can fall back. Those are the facts. Those are the receipts. And not wait for other people to do studies. The personal project that I'm involved with, the Tayo Help Desk, we're taking upon ourselves to do our own survey around Filipinos' attitudes around vaccination, because there is no data, and because of the larger challenge of the lack of disaggregated data. So we're not going to wait for others to do it. We're going to do it ourselves. So again, it goes back to what John said earlier. We all have a part we can play, big or small, and certainly things like that, when surveys do come out, please encourage your peers to take it, because this all goes back to helping all of us.
That's a great point, is that we need to be participating in the surveys and polls so that our voices are heard. Joon?
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think the health of any society really depends on how we treat our most vulnerable. And I think, just like John mentioned, gestures, to contribute to what our older adults are going through can be small as well. I mean, it's Mother's Day is coming up. I think even giving flowers to an older adult in the building you live in or you work in or in your community, I think can go a really long way. So any act of kindness, I think, matters right now.
I think that's a great point, Joon. As you say, Sunday is just a few days away, and if we could just really reach out to a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, that would be tremendous. I want to just respond one comment I saw from Josephine, that we must not forget the Native American population. And absolutely, we would wholeheartedly agree. At AARP, my colleague Ron Morey actually heads up the American Indian Alaska Native work for AARP, and they have some cross-cutting research that it will be coming out later this year. So if you want to know more, go to our AARP website and they have a page on it for the work that's being done in the American Indian Alaska Native community. Well, I really want to say thank you once again to our tremendous panelists, Leezel, Joon, and John, and to my team who helped put this all together. And once again, thank you to Edna for her tremendous leadership on this topic. More to come. AARP will always be involved with really advancing the work for our elders. And I just want to say that today's session has been recorded. And it will go up on our AARP AAPI community Facebook page. That's at AARP AAPI after this event. And we hope that you'll follow us on Facebook and on Twitter at AARP AAPI as well. And for more general information, we have a lot of information posted on aarp.org/AAPI. And right now, as Edna mentioned, there is a spread of 6 AAPIs and about their journey and about their heroes, and hope that you're able to read that as well too. For our Chinese partners and members of the community, please visit our chinese.aarp.org website, and we have in-language resources there. And if you have any questions or you're looking for more resources about this event, please contact PR@tdwandco.com. That's PR@tdwandco.com. That's TDW and Co. They are our agency, and they're the ones that have been working to put this together. So we hope you learned something that can help keep you and your loved ones safe, or you feel inspired to take action and join our national partners in their fight to protect and advocate for our AAPI elders. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Stay safe out there and have a good day. That concludes our event for today. Thank you so much.